As for Terri, so as I said earlier, she quickly recovered, and within 48 hours she was wide awake. And by Thanksgiving, she had a large meal, was quite active. She continued to evade the reporters. The health personnel didn't want her to have any contact with them. On November 27th, the Coast Guard investigators came to Terri in the hospital, and Captain Barber showed her a sketch of the Bluebelle deck. He then began asking her questions that contradicted Harvey's story. The mast was fine. There were no signs of any of the things that Harvey said, including the fire. Barbara said, "Terri, when you went up on deck, did you notice any damage to the rigging wire that stays holding the masts up?" Terry Jo said, "All the wires were perfect." Barbara, "Mr. Harvey told us that when the main mast fell down, this dragged over the mizzen mast. The rigging between dragged over the mizzen mast, which fell down and struck the deck. Did you notice the mizzen mast down on the decks?" Terry Jo, "It was standing up." Barbara, "Terry, in looking back now, do you think that Mr. Harvey harmed any of your family?" Terry hesitated. "I really don't know, because he might have." Barbara, "Do you know about or recall any arguments between Mr. Harvey and anybody else on the boat?" Terry, "No." "As best as you can remember, he was not angry with anybody on board?" Terry, "No." "When you went back on deck, you told us Mr. Harvey had something in his hand, which could have been a pail or bucket. Did you get the impression that he did not want you to come forward towards the forecastle?" Terry, "Yes." Barbara, "Please tell us why you had that impression." "I thought there was a whole bunch of blood and stuff, and he thought that it would make me sick, so he made me go below." Terry, "I believe you know now that Mr. Harvey did away with himself after he learned that you were alive. Do you know why he did that?" "No." "When you first awakened that night by screaming sounds and stamping of feet, you told us you heard your brother scream. Did you hear anything else?" "No, but my brother was saying, 'Help, Daddy, help!'" "You heard this quite clearly?" "Yes." "You didn't hear anyone else say anything?" "No." "Did you find out what the stamping noise?" "By that you mean you're not sure whether the noise came from the upper deck or the lower deck?" "I think it was the lower deck. I wasn't sure." "When you went up on the deck and saw Mr. Harvey come towards you, how'd he look?" "He seemed angry." "Did you notice any bloods or cuts or bruises on him?" "No." "Later, when the captain came into your room, did you still believe he had a rifle in his hand?" "Yes." "When you were first awakened, how long did you lie in your bunk before you got up?" 5 minutes, or 10 minutes." "Was the door to your room closed?" "Yes." "Before you got up, you thought you heard something going up the stairs. Is that right?" "Yes." "Do you think your mother and brother were in such a position that they could have fallen down the stairs?" "I don't think they fell down." "How long was it from the time you first awakened until you left the vessel in the lifeboat?" "About half an hour." "How deep was the water in your room when you got up?" "Up to my waist." "Terry, Mr. Harvey told us that after the mast fell down and he went forward to get the cable cutters, he could not get back to the stern because a fire broke out between him and the others. Will you tell us again if you saw or smelled or in any way detected a fire?" "I was positive that there wasn't any fire, but I did smell something like oil or something from the engine because the engine was right down near my room." "The night you went down to bed, was there any rain?" "No, but as soon as I got off on the raft, it started to rain." "Did you see the Bluebelle go down?" "No." It would have actually been impossible to see it go down because there was no light. It was a cloudy sky and in the middle of the night. "How long did it take the Bluebelle to sink after you left?" "As soon as I got off, I didn't look back." After this, which was the second interview, Murdoch was convinced that Harvey did it. There were too many people who said he was suspicious. He saw he was suspicious. His story didn't make any sense, whereas hers was too consistent. And this is an 11-year-old child. We have no reason whatsoever to doubt her, Murdoch said. There was no wreckage when she ran up to the deck, wreckage that would have been had to be there if Harvey's story were true. Her story is more convincing than ever. This child could not be possibly evading anything. We asked her the questions in the roughest sort of way. We planned the questions with the idea of trying to trip her up. She was straightforward and never deviated. Barber additionally said that he didn't think it occurred to Terri even that Harvey might have murdered those on board yet. On November 30th, Terri returned to Green Bay to live with her aunt and uncle, Dot and Ralph, and their 3 kids. Her grandmother also lived right nearby. Terri was quiet about sneaking back. She didn't want the press to know. She just wanted to be left alone for a while. And the family were cautious about bringing up the Bluebelle around her. The press were finally allowed to take photos of her with her new kitten, but they weren't allowed to ask any questions. Terri received a settlement from Harold Pegg. Pegg hadn't checked to see if Harvey even had his master's license, which was a requirement, or looked into his background much. The lawsuit created a trust for her that was useful in helping her attend private schools and acquire material things. Terri developed a love of reading and went to a private school pretty quickly, but then left again after everybody recognized her. Meanwhile, she was encouraged not to talk about the tragedy. Not wanting to relive it at first, that was just fine with her. When she eventually did see a therapist, they didn't talk about the Bluebelle either. PTSD was just not that well understood back then. And even mental health experts who knew about it often didn't know how to treat it. So instead, her therapist would discuss with Terri more normal adolescent problems she was having, like with boys in school. She wasn't troubled by nightmares and flashbacks, but she did have a phobia of black water and blood, as well as a lot of survivor's guilt. Terri was troubled in relationships as she got older. She would look for one, find it, and then lose it, one after another. Her first serious relationship was with a man named Gregor, but there was never any long-term potential, and they finally ended it after he was drafted to Vietnam in 1971. That same summer, she met another man named John at a 4th of July party and married him just 3 weeks later. In 1974, Terri had a baby with John, a daughter she named Brooke. Unfortunately, John was young, immature, and cheated a lot, and their marriage didn't last long. However, it wasn't all bad. Out of the marriage with John, though, she had grown attached to his family, and it was almost like a second family for her, John's family, as well as having a great relationship with her new daughter. Terri moved with John's brothers down to Florida that same year, and there she met another man living with him named Spencer. They moved in a tent together in Naples, Florida in 1976, and Terri had another daughter with him named Blair. Spencer joined the Army and they were stationed at Fort Bragg's. In 1978, Terri had a third child. This one was a son, whom she named Brian, after her older brother. But unfortunately, Spencer became cold and distant over the years and began doing drugs, and they were very miserable. Terri nevertheless tried to be a good wife, and the two of them, with their kids, relocated to Germany. In 1979, Terri's grandmother died, which was another major loss for her. And that same year, she also finally spoke about the Bluebelle tragedy, which at this point was about 18 years ago. It was during a questionnaire with a pediatrician who asked about her parents, if they were still alive, and what happened to them, and then he was shocked. Coincidentally enough, at this time, a reporter came around to interview her for the Green Bay Gazette, and she accepted, and it became a huge cover story in 1980, 19 years after the murders. And everybody remembered Terri and the Bluebelle at that time. That pediatrician eventually put her with a psychiatrist, and she began talking about it more. In 1980, Terri also left Germany and filed for divorce from her husband. Unfortunately, Spencer had quit contacting her and was in the hospital at the time for a drug addiction when she had sent the papers. She began attending college, and around this time met another man, somebody whose name she prefers not to say. They married, but his good nature, like Harvey's had been, was only a mask. He was not only abusive and dangerous, he'd been hiding a history of pedophilia from her, and she and her children finally had to flee from him. There was one good thing to happen amidst all this horrific tragedy. In 1962, a year later, something happened that would change the entire world and how they responded to disasters on the high seas. And this has undoubtedly saved many lives. Up until that point, most life jackets and life-saving appliances were white and gray, and thousands of people had already died as a result of this mistake, including some passengers on board the Titanic. It, of course, made spotting survivors in the ocean much harder. However, as a result of the attention Terri's story received, the Coast Guard suggested an opposite color, something that would contrast with the waters, be mandated on all life-saving devices and life jackets. This became international law in 1962, and ever since then, life preservers and devices like corks have been orange. So, as a result of this tragedy and Terri's survival, thousands of deaths have been prevented all around the world. The tragedy of the Bluebelle continued to haunt Terri. In her own words, she said, "I didn't believe my father was dead because I had not seen him. I would pick up and leave on a whim and drive to, like, North Carolina Beach or Florida Beach. I was always looking for my dad. I was always searching for him. I did that for many years until about 35, and then I finally accepted it." You would think that the ocean would have made Terri afraid of it, but instead she bonded with water. To her, the ocean had saved her from something far more dangerous than itself when it took her away from Harvey. In 1986, she began working for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and eventually became a manager of water. Her job was to preserve water from pollution. She was to protect water as it once protected her. In 1988, Terri went on the Oprah Winfrey Show and was reunited with Captain Kusadontis. That was also when Dead Calm came out with Billy Zane, Sam Neill, and Nicole Kidman, inspired by the Bluebelle tragedy. But it was a very different story, and actually far less dramatic and unbelievable than her story. A decent movie, and I recommend it, but it's nothing like Terri's story. Finally, in 1990, she met her final husband, Ron, who was a very good man. He's a very good man, and they remain a healthy marriage to this day. Her children went on to have their own children in the last 20 years, and so now Terri is a grandmother, and she's since retired. She was briefly interviewed on television again in the 2000s with her family, the clips of which you can find online. Her daughter says that my mom is the greatest hero I know. Now I'm going to complete this podcast with a message from Terri taken directly from her book. What I want to stress to all those who read this book is never give up, always have hope, and try to look on the bright side of things. Be positive, be trusting, and try to go with the flow. Have compassion, give of yourself to those in need, and be loving and kind. This concludes the Bluebelle Murders. If you enjoyed this podcast, hit like and subscribe, and be on the lookout. I'm going to have many other very interesting stories. Until then, Stay safe. There are a lot of dangerous people out there, and you don't want me talking about your story someday.